May I invite also Batanai Chikwene to join us for the final session. As we noted yesterday, this final session, a very brief one, is really to take on board our discussions from yesterday and also this morning, and now to move to a focus on the Continental Free Trade Area negotiations. What are the implications of what we have been discussing? The problems, the challenges, the experiences, but also our focus in some extremely important substantive, practical trade issues related to standards, to dispute resolution, to various regulatory interventions which are absolutely essential for us to integrate our markets and economies, for us to trade effectively amongst ourselves and also with the rest of the world, to support our efforts to industrialize, to forge linkages across borders in search of efficiency and competitiveness. So this final session, what we will do is to ask Batanai Chikwene comes from the Department of Trade and Industry at the African Union Commission, and he's also a graduate of the master's program that tralac has been offering in collaboration with the University of Cape Town. In fact, he achieved a distinction for his master's, so we're very proud that Batanai is one of our alumni. He's going to provide us a very brief overview of where we are as far as the tripartite FTA negotiations process is concerned. And then Gerard Erasmus, Batanai, and I will start a conversation with you about some of the important questions related to the process, including, of course, issues that we have raised, in fact, yesterday already, about the design of the legal instruments, about dispute resolution, would it be available for private parties, and such really important design architectural questions, as well as some practical issues about the sequencing of the negotiations. What is feasible? What is possible? What is pragmatic? And what is likely to work? And of course, what will be politically acceptable?
Now, very briefly, in terms of where we are with the CFTA process, first, I think it's important to highlight to the audience that the CFTA is anchored within the Boosting Intra-African Trade Initiative, which basically realizes that a market integration, a purely market integration approach within Africa does not have the results looking at the history of integration within the continent. So the CFTA is just one part of the Boosting Intra-African Trade Initiative, which has about 7 clusters, which range from trade facilitation, productive capacity building, trade-related infrastructure, factor market integration, trade finance, and some other clusters. So basically, the CFTA fits into a developmental regional integration kind of approach. And in addition to that, we've also realized that if you do not carry along key stakeholders in the process, then you are mostly negotiating an agreement for bureaucrats, for government officials. So it places emphasis, places value on the importance of having the private sector meaningfully engaged in the process. So it's one thing to have that on paper at the continental level, and quite another to have that machinery effectively working on the ground in Namibia, in South Africa, in Nigeria. And we think that that is one area where we can have a meaningful agreement where the implementers are actually involved in the process. I think in terms of where we are, we just had the first meeting of the negotiating forum the 3rd week of February. And in that meeting, members agreed to a set of rules of procedure that should govern how they conduct business, how they conduct their negotiations when they are negotiating the CFTA among themselves. And we are in the process of organizing the second meeting of the negotiating forum during the week of 18 to 22 May. And before that, we are going to organize a meeting of the task force. The task force is basically composed of the 8 recognized regional economic communities, African Development Bank, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. That meeting will be followed by a meeting of senior officials and the ministers of trade, and eventually that should feed into the July summit. Now, in terms of content, now that we are done with sorting out how the NF works, we are now going into the substance. And one of the first assignments that we're going to be dealing with is the definition of the negotiating principles. Some of you are aware that when the members adopted the principles, it was just broad statements, things like we build on the acquis, things like consensus, decision-making, things like MFN, without going into what it means for the negotiations. So one of the assignments that the NF will be looking at is giving meaning to those definitions, to those principles. And then in terms of the bigger process, we are still guided by the 2017 deadline, and it's up to members to define modalities in such a way that you are able to meet that deadline. If you are not able to do so, then you come and report on the progress and see the various ways in which the process can be moved forward. Now, Trudy, I don't know if you want me to go into some of the things that should really be in the trade governance as they affect the CFTA, so that I save time here. So now I'm going to be linking the substance of the trade governance development implications for CFTA and the process. So one of the assignments that the NF is going to be seized with is the definition of the principles. And there's a great danger here that these principles can be defined in such a way that the CFTA cannot deliver on its objectives. So again, this is an appeal to members that as the process unfolds, be engaged. If you want to come up with a CFTA that deals with the challenges of overlapping membership, the challenges of multiple membership, then define the principles in such a way that it doesn't lend itself to such an outcome. So be aware in the process. Do not let others define the principles for you in such a way that when the negotiations themselves come, it becomes simply impossible to have it any other way. So if you look at the objectives of the CFTA, the call is come up with interpretation of the principles that is consistent with what you want to achieve. Do not let the process derail or go out of the channel. Then the next important thing is, I think a point was made this morning that continental initiatives, they are too, perhaps maybe philosophical or too abstract, not that meaningful at a member state level. And we've always had this challenge of calling member states to rather, maybe, let me say, align their national development strategies, sectoral development strategies, to continental objectives. Or if you want to bring it to trade, is your national negotiating mandate aligned to the continental or regional objectives? If that is not there, then it's always going to be a challenge to implement or to domesticate, as it were, initiatives that are regional or continental at the national level. I think we'll have a discussion on this. And then the other important thing as we design this agreement is stakeholder engagement. There is evidence that an inclusive process in most cases, results in agreements that are implementable in projects that have impact on the ground. So again, at the continental level, we have the African Business Council that we are in the process of establishing. But as long as this council does not have grassroots foot soldiers, people that demand in Zambia or in Mali or in Nigeria to be included in the dialogue on how the CFTA should look like, it's not going to be that useful. You need to have people on the ground whose positions fit into the national position on how the CFTA should look like. The next important thing is the movement of business persons. If you're African in this room, you are aware that you need, if you are going to travel to an African country, most likely 55% of the countries will require that you get a visa before departure. 25% of the countries will give you a visa on arrival. And there are countries that don't have that facility at all. A study has been done by the African Development Bank on the African Visa Openness Index. I would encourage you to go through that report. Very, very insightful. But the thing is, goods and services move in pursuit of people. So as long as you don't allow people to move, you are also in a way restricting trade in both goods and services. But the good news is that the African Union has come up with an initiative to come up with an African passport that I think in the next few months there should be some movement in terms of how we move. And there's an agenda there's a decision actually by 2018 to remove all visas. And it comes back to the issue that we've been discussing. We may have nice protocols, all these things that whatever name you want to give them. If they are not implemented, they are of no effect in terms of boosting trade and improving the lives of people on the continent. Then the next important thing is let us design an agreement that works for small and medium enterprises. Most countries in Africa have their business sector actually comprised of this segment. So if we come up with an agreement, it has to speak to how they do business. If we don't do this, then we are actually segmenting them out of what the CFTA could bring for them. And we have seen the TPP has attempted to come up with a chapter on SMEs. Can we learn from that and extract elements we think could be useful as we move forward with our CFTA? The definition of modalities, I think I've spoken to this, and then elements to do with capacity building. Most countries don't have the capacity to negotiate, and in partnership with organizations such as tralac, we think we can be able to build such capacity at national level. I'll have to stop here and then hope that I'll be able to make some of the points in the conversation. Thank you.
This gives us the very broad scope of where we are right now. As Batanai has indicated, the first meeting of the Trade Negotiating Forum has taken place and another one is scheduled for next month. There's an opening question, Gerrit, that I would like to ask you. Why don't the two of you join me here and we have a conversation? May I ask, just to get the two microphones from the back as well. Gerrit, Batanai has warned about the interpretation of the guiding principles. And as we know, the guiding principles for the CFTA have been copied exactly from the guiding principles of the tripartite free trade area negotiations, where they have been given a particular interpretation. So can you tell us what you see as some of the important issues that must be kept in mind as these guiding principles are interpreted? Batanai has correctly pointed out that if they are interpreted, in fact, as they were interpreted in the case of the tripartite FTA, we will not solve the overlapping membership problem. Because in the tripartite FTA, as we know, not all 26 member states are negotiating with one another. Only those member states that are not party to a free trade area are negotiating tariff liberalization. This means that instead of having a resolution to the overlapping membership problem, we are in fact complicating it. The risk that we will have the same situation for the CFTA will depend on how those negotiating principles are interpreted. Gerard, what should we do here?
Well, then, as we've heard from Batanai, the next meeting is going to be focusing on, and that is the term that is used, defining the negotiating principles. They are not yet defined. Defining them, and Batanai has confirmed that, holds the danger that the bigger objective behind the CFTA could in fact be impaired, could be limited, could be impacted on in a negative way. So it's important that we understand we are going to have negotiations prior to the negotiations, and this is an extremely sensitive process lying ahead. Now, if we remember that the negotiations are member-driven, and we learn from the experience from the tripartite, those who will make proposals now on how to interpret the acquis, variable geometry, consensus, special and differential treatment, there are about 12 of these principles. Some of them are not really controversial, like the MFN and the national treatment. They are substance. They're not, I don't think they're the worrying ones. The implication is, and the guiding question here is, what is the continental FTA to become in terms of a legal instrument? Negotiations is about creating, adopting a piece of legislation. An international agreement is a legal instrument between governments, between states, and once it is concluded and it's entered into force, it must be implemented in order to achieve those objectives for which we have started the exercise. Now, the framework, the CFTA framework of last June, talks of a comprehensive agreement suitable for contemporary challenges, 21st century challenges, to boost intra-African trade. So, obviously, there is this vision of a new type of approach. The danger is truly that we will, while buying into the new vision, will have a secondary process of defining the acquis, defining variable geometry, in a manner that will do a different thing, that will promote how individual nation states pursue offensive and defensive market access and related interests. So there's a tension here. And the tension can't be ignored. States will negotiate in a manner which will promote their individual understanding of promoting national development needs and interests and protecting markets. And that is the lesson from the tripartite. So I want to conclude by saying, unless there is ownership taken of this extremely sensitive process, we should not be surprised if the logical thing happens, that a member-driven process will look at this opportunity and say, we are the sovereign states, we have to sign, we have to ratify, we have to use this instrument, this is what we want to use it for. And there's nothing wrong with that. The danger is that we may then be repeating an exercise that will not look substantially different from what we have in the past. And that is the danger. And I haven't yet seen that that entity, that program of action that will guard how this very important initial preparation unfolds, which will steer the eventual direction. And just remember, ladies and gentlemen, that some of the difficulties will not be resolved. The RECs, the 8 RECs, will continue to exist after we've concluded the tripartite. And that in itself is a major design challenge of how these various entities, and the registrars, by the way, how these existing entities will continue to cooperate and work with each other in order to boost this continental ambition.
That is extremely important to remember because Batanai, the tripartite free trade area, if we go back to the 2008 summit, where heads of state agreed to establish the tripartite free trade area, the objective there was to resolve, amongst other objectives, the problem of overlapping membership. So we had an enormous diversion from that original objective. The objectives that Gerard has reminded of us of for the CFTA are very ambitious. Whether or not we will embark on a path to achieve those objectives will depend on this interpretation as a first step, very definitely. Also on the national interests, offensive and defensive interests of member states. That's the fabric of negotiations at the end of the day. But the guiding principles are material. This maps, to some extent, the route on which we will embark. And if we don't get that right now, we will, right from the outset, be on a different pathway and repeating what we have done before, not charting a new trajectory for a 21st century agreement. When it comes to, can I ask both of you about the sequencing of the negotiations? We've been told that phase one of the negotiations will be where there are two tracks of negotiations, one for trade and goods matters, another for trade and services matters. So they take place simultaneously. That has some advantages. And then there's a phase two, during which competition, investment, and intellectual property issues will be negotiated. Now, within the track on trade and goods, for example, of course, the sequencing of the negotiations will matter. In terms of the architecture of the negotiations, there will be technical working groups on different substantive issues. To what extent will we be able to see a prioritization of particular issues? And this brings us back to the discussion we've had in the last day and a half on some of these substantive issues, such as standards, the technical barriers to trade, which are extremely important to facilitate trade. But of course, there are many more: trade facilitation, non-tariff barriers, customs and border management, and so on, which really fall under the broad banner of trade facilitation. And then there's tariff liberalization. And the tariff liberalization is perhaps the most contentious area of the trade and goods agenda to negotiate, along with rules of origin. Because, of course, the rules of origin matter, because it's only if traders, exporters comply with the rules of origin that they get the benefit of the preferences. Otherwise, they pay the higher duties. So those two hang together and are very contentious. How can we ensure that there's a productive discussion about sequencing of the negotiations differently so that we can move ahead in areas of substantive trade regulation and governance where we are in more agreement than we are on tariff and rules of origin issues? What would you say to that?
Yeah, thank you, Trudy. Probably on the issue of the principles, perhaps let me mention that if you look at the very first draft of the principles and what we have now on the table is adopted by the summit, those two documents are completely different, which I think speaks to the nature of the process we are engaged in. Member states are more comfortable with what they are familiar with. Now, coming to the issue of sequencing, with that in mind, they've always understood trade negotiations to be chiefly aimed at reducing tariffs and fixing rules of origin in an FTA context. Now, how amenable are they to the idea that we can actually start with issues to do with trade facilitation, standards, and then at the end look at tariff reduction and rules of origin? As Commission, we are open to make such a proposal what we then hope for is that there will be enough number of countries to buy into the idea, because like Professor said, it's a member state driven process, and some of the members could actually want to use the challenges that come out of tariffs and rules of origin as a way of postponing the coming into effect of the CFTA, whereas others may also want to have this done as soon as possible. So again, it's a proposal that the Commission can look at positively.
But I think, Bhattana, if I'm listening to you carefully, Gerrit, come in on this. What Bhattana is saying, that we need champions among the member states who are thinking differently about the continental free trade area, who are prepared to discuss and consider new approaches. And this is going to be a task of our government officials and other stakeholders here represented, and of course in the broader trade integration and African community. Are there member states, Gerrit, what are the options? Do you think it is possible that we will be able to engage such a discussion, find champions for new thinking, new proposals such as this sequence?
Truly, don't look at me for finding champions. I think there's a sufficient awareness about this particular aspect and the sensitivities about how to launch this. Now, there is a unique historical development here in the sense that the African Union Commission is now, and I believe this is really the first time, that you are made responsible for the technicalities and the preparations and the taking care of a very complicated and sensitive process, which is, on the other hand, vital. And where you will be positioned politically in a process which is not commission-driven, but it's member-driven. That interplay between your role, which should not be limited to making resource available and booking flights, and we already know how difficult that is, but being able to influence and infuse into the process the concepts of original thinking, pragmatic ideas of where you want to end up. There must be a constant reminder of what this exercise is really about. We must be realistic. Trade negotiations result in, as Michael has said yesterday, blood on the table. Now, if that is our metaphor in the sense of a very traditional approach to it, then you are hinting at an initial danger here around the concept of what is an FTA. This is called the Continental FTA. The terminology traditionally means Article 24 of the GATT. Article 24 of the GATT speaks of trade in goods. And I would not be surprised if certain representatives will get up and say, we've already adopted an official decision, this is called the Continental FTA. And therefore it must by definition be about trade in goods. Now the response to that must be that the world has moved on from 1947. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it calls itself a partnership with 30 chapters, and the first paragraph in the preamble also talks about an FTA. There's nothing inherent or limiting us to keep in mind the other instructions of the summit of last year. Remember, it is not only a name that was adopted, it was a comprehensive set of instructions about a new, a modern arrangement. So how to picture in a technical sense from day one something which is called an FTA but must be a comprehensive partnership will require a constant surveillance of this challenge. Are we on the right track? Are we on the track of a comprehensive agreement which is inherently consistent, will be about trade in goods and trade in services and investment and IP and competition and all the other necessary disciplines that come within those packages. If you talk about trade and services, you must talk about the new formula, and you've got strong ideas about that, prioritizing sectors and prioritizing regulatory reforms, prioritizing the ability to fly from one country to another. I wasn't aware of the fact that I was here for business this morning. But be it as it may, the constant taking care of the original compact, the idea, to make sure that we are heading in the right direction, that is what should also belong in the guiding principles, protecting the system itself. Otherwise, the real interpretation might be, to what extent is this member-driven, focused on trading goods, and the two principles that are vital in my book are the acquis and the variable geometry.
Thanks very much. I think we're heading towards the end of this session and a very quick lunch and then to the harbour trip. But this is an extremely important conversation about an initiative that will have an impact on all of us, and hopefully also on the way we move as citizens of African countries amongst the neighbours. I'd like to, at this point, draw the discussion to a close and to thank everybody very, very much for their participation. George, Chairman of our board, we're very pleased that you did make it for the conference this morning. The honourable judges from the Comesa Court of Justice, members of the diplomatic community, representatives of government departments, regional secretariats, and of course all our stakeholders in the private sector, civil society organizations, those non-state actors who are ultimately the beneficiaries of an agreement such as the CFTA. Our discussion has been very, very broad-ranging. If we look at our fundamental theme again of rules-based governance in trade and African integration, we find that progress is variable. In areas related to rules of origin and tariffs, progress is perhaps not as good as we would like at this stage, and the implementation and compliance with commitments raises a lot of concerns about rules-based governance. In other areas, we may find more progress. Let us build incrementally on those areas where progress is possible. And the logic of that takes us to a new conversation about the continental free trade area, about the design, the architecture of the agreement, but also the very practical issues that Batanai and his colleagues at the African Union Commission, the other regional secretariats, and the negotiators from all the member states' delegations will be facing in levels of intensity that we perhaps have not seen in trade negotiations for a very, very long time. So we wish you all the best, and we look forward to hearing progress on those meetings, the clarification, the definition of the principles, and the pathway that our negotiators will embark on in a quest for rules-based trade and integration in a 21st century Africa and a 21st century global economy.